We're all turned on?
Only by you, yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 17 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. I'm joined by Mitchell and Christian today, and we're going to be talking about Dead Man, a film directed by Jim Jarmusch and starring Johnny Depp as William Blake, a mild-mannered accountant who moves to a frontier town in the Old West, but finds that his job has been taken. He soon becomes involved in a gunfight and accidentally kills a man and finds himself fleeing this town, pursued by bounty hunters and marshals and all manner of criminals and hunters. And it's about him making his way in the backwoods, led only by a Native American named Nobody. So we'll start, as usual, with our overall thoughts. What did you guys think of the movie?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I'm kind of the dissenting opinion
Yes, you
again,
are.
unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
But I gave this film a 2.5 out of 5, meaning, yes, I know, I love my half points.
Yeah, I had one too.
Yeah. I enjoyed parts of it, and I thought it was relatively well made, but there's a lot of, maybe a little too much for me, a lot of dead air, and a lot of not necessarily meaningless quiet moments, but just a lot of walking through the forest and having a conversation with nobody, and then somebody shows up and we shoot him and we hear the same electric guitar play a couple notes and it sounds cool, and then we keep walking and talking. And I get that most of those encounters serve a purpose, and it's sort of meant to show how passive William Blake is in the context of the situations he's presented with, and the inciting incident of him shooting and killing that man. But to me, it just wasn't super entertaining. And while I don't think the movie was trying to aspire towards that entertaining, attention-grabbing type portrayal and presentation, for me, that isn't enough to critically reconcile it. Usually, my critical appraisal of something is there's kind of two halves to it. It's, does the film do what it intends to do? And is the film entertaining? And sometimes if the film's purpose is not necessarily to be entertaining, then that is enough for me to accept that. But usually those kind of have to go hand in hand to some extent for me. So the 2.5 out of 5 is almost like a perfect score for how much it does what it intends to do. But for me, I personally did not find it very entertaining. So for that reason, I gave it a middling score.
Yeah, okay, I can understand that. Mitchell, what did you think?
Well, there was a lot of it that was very intriguing and thought-provoking, and that's like the best, most positive review I could give it. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5, and I can tell definitely that a lot of the budget was towards making this historically accurate and making it very immersive, and I can definitely understand how and why that's important. But like Christian mentioned, I think my critique of it is definitely in the similar perspective from Christian's. But I would say that it's a lot of, the dead air is definitely necessary a lot of the time, but sometimes it really just kills the whole momentum of the film. And if you're really not tagging on the whole time, if you're not really looking at it the way that it was supposed to be looked at, and you're not totally in line with the director's point of view and how, if you're not in his head, basically, then you're really not going to get what the film is even about, or, what's supposed to be so interesting and intriguing. So, and there's just too many instances of that, I would say. There's definitely a lot to look at, and there's a lot to think about. There's different concepts that are in here that aren't really looked at movies too much, and this is definitely a unique way of looking at it, quite literally being, black and white, and also being in the Old West. So this is definitely another part of the neo-Western genre, I guess. But I would say I have to compare it to No Country for Old Men, because it's that's very similar to what we had just seen, but there's in that film there's a lot of tension kind of to replace a lot of the dead air, and the only thing really replacing any dead air in this is the electric guitar in the background. And the I will say that the West is very, interesting, and there's a lot to look at in one way. But really, if you already kind of know what to expect in like the American frontier and things like that, you're really not looking at anything you haven't already seen in a Western movie. Maybe that was the point, but it's not hitting home with me at all. And it loses its allure, and the mystery kind of unravels quite quickly earlier on. With that, so the creativity is, once you get used to it, it's kind of it's hammered home way too hard, in my opinion. But overall, there's a lot to take from this in terms of like philosophical and the cultural allusions are really cool and unique and things like that. But it's not. I don't think it's enough to carry the film to anything higher than a 3.5 for me.
Okay. It's interesting you should mention historical accuracy. I was doing some reading up on this film, and apparently this film, when it came out, was highly praised by Native American audiences for its historically accurate portrayal of Native American tribes. Apparently in the dialogue to this film, there are actually like in-jokes and secret bits of humor in Cree and Blackfoot, which are specifically targeted at Native American audiences. And people who don't know those languages might not necessarily get or understand them, which I think is great because it's kind of taking all audiences into perspective. In terms of the film overall, I really love this movie. I can understand your guys' complaints or your hang-ups over the potential dead air in the movie, but I think that's really part of Jim Jarmusch's style as a director. Like you said, Mitchell, this is a movie that you really need to be kind of in the mind of the director. And this is a movie that I think demands your attention. This is not the kind of film that is going to, like, if you're getting bored, is not going to pop in a gunfight or a bank robbery or something to bring you back. This is a movie where you've kind of got to do the work to stay focused into it. Personally, I don't find that a problem. I find that I'm pretty much always entertained by Jim Jarmusch's films. He has this sort of style in his movies where a lot of his films are pretty much entirely composed of just long, placid conversations, like you pointed out, Christian, where not a great deal happens. But I think for a lot of people, including myself, those conversations are really engrossing. So even though most of the film is dialogue and just these characters talking, and maybe they're not necessarily even talking about that much, there's something really magnetic about it, I find. I think it's potentially the way Jarmusch directs actors, where even when they're doing the slightest, tiniest emotions or just talking to somebody else, you just can't help but look at them. I think in a lot of ways this movie has the qualities of, say, a good stage play, where a lot of it's quite static, a lot of it's quite localized, but based on the performances and the writing and the things that are happening, you're really drawn into it, even though it might not be as exciting or flashy as a typical Western. Christian, you mentioned the guitar score in your kind of overall thoughts. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. The score for this film was done by Neil Young, and it was pretty much entirely done on electric guitar. Earlier in the film, there's some organ, very, very briefly, but most of this movie is just that electric guitar. What did we think of that choice for the score? Did you think it was too simple to take you out, to draw you in? What did you guys think?
I didn't think it was too simple necessarily, and at first I really liked the musical. I liked the way it was written just as a piece of music. But when I was about halfway through the movie, I realized, wow, pretty much every bit of guitar playing is just kind of the same thing over and over again. And in the second half of the movie, there's, I think, a lot more variation in the guitar breaks and the different songs. I think that might be meant to show some progress, but I was getting a little bored and frustrated by the guitar after hearing the same twangy riff for the 10th time in a row. And the sound is it's a cool sound and it's a fine piece of music as it is written, but it felt the slightest bit out of place given the setting, to me at least. And after hearing it multiple times, it rapidly lost tension and feeling to me wherever it was placed in the movie. So I think I would have liked it more if he had written more unique pieces instead of the same thematic sort of intention going throughout the entire thing. And it was fine as a piece of music, but a little overused in terms of the one main riff that we heard the most often.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mitchell?
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with what Christian said. I don't really remember the score for The Quick and the Dead. I would have to watch it again to remember it exactly. Mm-hmm. But I feel like a score for this, I think, would fit that a lot more. And not because, it's just a traditional Western and they're going too far away from a traditional Western. I understand that wasn't even the point of this at all. This is very obviously completely different, out of left field for that genre. But I mean, it was good. Like I said, it was early on. It was very hypnotic and like minimalist and not really, it wasn't really too much in your face. You didn't really think about it too much. But once you kind of hear it over and over again, and the different songs sounded very similar, like Christian had said, and it was just a little bit too overused, and some of the scenes were a little too like explicit for it to have such a score like that, because the score is kind of supposed to be like a thought thinking, like that's when you're supposed to be thinking. I think is when why I tried to implement it like that. Like that's what it's supposed to be like okay, you hear the and you're like, okay, now I have to think about what just happened and things like that. But if you weren't invested in the scene at all, or you weren't invested in the events leading up to that scene, then you're really not. The score's just going to be annoying. Like if you're not thinking during those moments, like once it kind of falls back into the direct thinking like the director. If you're really not being if you're not being thought provoked, I guess, then the score is not going to work for you very well. And definitely, I think it was just a little bit too overused. But the score itself and the actual quality of the music, I think, is pretty good. I think Neil Young does a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Okay.
I should cut in real quick, Zach, and we've talked in the past about how there's sort of two different types of score. There's the wallpaper type that sort of sits in the background, that tends to be your preference, Zach. And then there's a more orchestral type, or just generally more musical things going on, more to listen to, which can sometimes overshadow the scene in question. I think that this music, for me, was kind of an uncomfortable middle ground between those two.
Yeah.
Because even though it was one instrument the entire time and a similar theme being played that might imply a wallpaper type approach, it was very, very loud in the context of the film. Like when the guitar came in, you heard the guitar. You didn't really hear much, if anything else.
Right on top of the layers.
I would say if there was more natural sounds, if there was a lot more natural sounds in this, and I know that sounds like I'm simping for No Country for Old Men again, but no, seriously, like if they had more natural sounds embedded with the music, and the music was literally toned down, like lower in volume, then I would have appreciated it a lot more.
Yeah.
Okay. There is an interesting contrast, I think, between this score and No Country for Old Men, a Western that has pretty much no score, and this movie, a Western that has a very simple but very big score. I think that this score works really well for this film. I think in a lot of ways, it's very different from a typical score, partially in the way it was composed. This is not a situation where Neil Young watched the movie and then wrote something and then played it. The way they did the score was Neil Young sat down in a recording booth, and while watching the movie, he improvised these compositions, and then that was what became the score. And I personally think that works, because for me at least, this movie feels very stream of consciousness. It feels like we're just going from one place to another with William Blake and Nobody, and seeing what happens, and I think the score kind of reflects that. It's not really all that structured, it's not really all that pre-planned, because it wasn't pre-planned. It kind of feels like it's just flowing out of Neil Young as the movie happens. As you mentioned, Christian, I think there is a really nice sound to this as well. As I mentioned pretty much every other episode, it seems, I am not a music man. But these kind of guitar chords that he plays have this really kind of echoey, big feel to them. And I think in a lot of ways that really emphasizes kind of how small and alone Johnny Depp's character is in this film. Because he's just an accountant. He's not really used to being on the run from the law or being forced to be in this kind of desperado type role. So he's sort of isolated and all alone in the backcountry, and I think the score sort of reflects the hugeness of the world and the environment around him, in his perspective at least. And I also, kind of one of my theories is that I think Jim Jarmusch directed this movie to sort of feel like a dream in a lot of ways. And I think the score definitely adds to that kind of dreamy, semi-conscious atmosphere. But going off of that same idea, this movie has a very eclectic cast. There are a lot of big names in this. You've got Robert Mitchum as Mr. Dickinson, who sends the bounty hunters after William Blake. You've got Johnny Depp, of course, as our lead character. John Hurt plays the main receptionist for Mr. Dickinson. Gabriel Byrne gets shot by William Blake. Then we've got Alfred Molina later in the film, Lance Henriksen. There's all sorts of big stars in this movie. Why do you think Jarmusch might have chosen to cast all these big names in so many small parts? Do you think there's a reason he might have done that?
I don't know. I mean,
I'm not an aspiring director, Zach.
Well, I was interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, neither am I, but I mean, I'll say for Alfred Molina, I think his part and his scene was probably my favorite part of the film.
Oh, okay.
Even though he was kind of a bit character and you kind of blink and you'll miss it scene and then he's gone. But I don't know. I think maybe there's just a attention to quality, and with those big names you're going to get well acted characters and scenes. So, and I think it's a credit to Jim Jarmusch that he could get these guys to work on what I assume was and is a relatively small project that might not have the same commercial appeal as other larger projects they've worked on. So.
Yeah, it was a $9 million budget, so bigger than you might expect, but not massive. Yeah, any additional thoughts, Mitchell? Or
Yeah, I mean, it was jarring in a good way, I guess, to see the ensemble cast. It was very surprising. I didn't want to look at the cast list beforehand. I just wanted to know that Johnny Depp was in it. So it was very interesting to say, oh, hey, there he is, every time. But, I mean, it helped like artificial viewer engagement, I guess. Any person who watches movies at least casually will recognize them from something. So that's always a good thing, I guess. And it must have been not terribly difficult to cast them for this. I mean, they might have all been like on vacation or something, and then they get a text and they're like, yo, want to be in this neo-western, you just got to say this and this and be sad, and they'll be like, yeah, I can do that. So I mean, it's a lot easier just to throw an ensemble cast into the water and be like, do your thing, and then see how it turns out. And that's a very creative way of doing it, I think. I'm just going to assume that maybe is how he did it, because that's what it looked like to me. But yeah, I mean, it added a little bit to it, but it wasn't like I'm so glad they're in it or anything.
Oh yeah.
Like in my opinion, I mean, I think if you know enough about films, you can kind of understand it's not really that terribly important if they're in these smaller roles that they're actually in it. But yeah, I mean, it was okay. I was glad to see them there. I appreciated it.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard, Jim Jarmusch has like a lot of friendships in Hollywood. He's apparently a very casual, easygoing director, an easy guy to work with, so he makes a lot of friends really quickly, and it's pretty easy for him to invite these people onto his films from what I've heard. So I think part of it is that it's fun to work with all these different names and put them in the film. And I think there's also a humor aspect to it as well. It's kind of funny in an off-the-wall way to see, like, Iggy Pop dressed in women's clothing making beans for Billy Bob Thornton before he gets shot in the foot. Yeah, I really like that scene. That's one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie, when he gets shot in the foot and it takes him like 2 seconds to react. Yeah. But I think, kind of adding to my dream theory as well, I think one of the reasons he chose to work with so many big names on this movie is that adding that kind of dimension of making it feel like a dream. Your brain, when constructing a dream, tends to pick out faces that you know. So when you're in a dream, you might be walking along and find some guy on the side of the street and, wait a minute, that guy has my dad's face. And then you keep walking and, oh, wait a minute, that guy has Harrison Ford's face. Like, your brain tends to just pick out faces and people and throw them into your dreams because it's just randomly spiraling through images. And I think that might be a big part of what this movie's meant to be. It's kind of that idea of this movie trying to be like a dream and using those recognizable faces on characters you probably wouldn't associate them with, I mean, I don't look at Alfred Molina and think of like a priest selling smallpox blankets or something like that. Like, I think that's kind of an off-the-wall character for somebody like him. And we also mentioned Iggy Pop as the woman dressing scavenger. Like, that's totally off the wall as well. So I think that dream aspect is definitely a part of it.
Yeah. And the deadpan kind of aura to it as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of moments in this of very, very dry humor. There's some broader stuff too, but I think a lot of the humor is kind of just conversational. I think one of the bits that makes me laugh the most in the film every single time I watch it is there's a scene where the three bounty hunters are just riding along, and one of them is established to talk a lot. And they're just riding along and the sun's setting, and he says something like, "Don't you like that the sun goes down bit by bit? Imagine if it just went out, bam, like that." It'd scare the bejesus out of me. And then the scene ends. I think there's lots of just great, like, fly-on-the-wall humor like that throughout the entire movie.
And he gets eaten.
And then he gets eaten very suddenly. Now, this movie is also shot in black and white. This movie was made in the late 90s. So the technology to film it in color was definitely there. Like I said, it was made for $9 million, so they definitely had the money to film it in color. Why do you think they made the decision to make this movie in black and white? And do you think it adds to or takes away from the movie?
I think it definitely adds to the movie in a lot of ways. And if you have a movie, generally, if you have a very nihilistic movie, then you can probably have it in black and white, and it'll most likely work out. I mean, if there's not much to look at in the Western frontier anyway, that's color. Just a lot of, dull. Pretty much the brightest thing is the sun. That's it. And I don't even think we see the sun in this at all. But establishing the setting is kind of inherent in its historical accuracy with, the guns and the smaller localities and things like that, and the costumes and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I would have been, if I saw this in black and white and then saw it in color, I'd be very bothered that it was in color. Yeah. Because there's too much brightness, and a lot of this seems to be in the daytime. Some of it was at night, but a lot of it was in the daytime. And if he was trying to, there's a lot of older films that are westerns that that are not necessarily all action, that are also very nihilistic in their tone, that completely go anti-romanticism. And glorification of the West and things like that. And I think that is also, that's another reason why they might have made it black and white. But yeah, I really liked it. I think that was the best. I think that was a good creative decision to make for this type of movie.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't bothered by it necessarily, but when you have the means of shooting something in color and you shoot it in black and white for a tonal reason, to me, it feels like somewhat of a shortcut. That might be harsh, but like Mitchell said, black and white definitely suits the tone and the genre and all that they're striving towards with this film. But I would not have minded seeing more colors, and I think there's a way to make this aesthetically dull and toned down, even if it were in color. And I don't know. I think that just generally a viewer is more inclined and more interested when the thing is in color, even if it's a movie like this. Like, for example, I think No Country for Old Men would have been less interesting to me if it was in black and white. And that's just, it's less of a deeper critical understanding and more of an instinctual, what is visually interesting to me in my brain type thing.
Okay.
So I it's not a huge problem. It didn't really factor into my critical appraisal of the movie, but I wouldn't have minded it being in color if they chose to go that route.
I would say that sorry, Zach.
Oh no, go right ahead.
I would say that No Country for Old Men might have been good in black and white as well. I think it would have matched the aesthetic pretty well, but now after seeing it in color, would I want to see it in black and white? No. So it's kind of like,
yeah, exactly.
I don't really know how to feel about it, but I mean, I don't know if that's hypocritical or not, but I don't know. I think in No Country for Old Men there was still a lot to look at, especially because it's not the 1800s. and there's still a lot of like signs, and when it's dark it's more mysterious and you can't see very much, and you can achieve that with black and white as well. But if you see a lot of color, I think black is more appreciated. And whiteness and very bright colors are more appreciated when it's in color. But when you see black and white, color is kind of thrown out the window pretty much. And darkness and lightness, it doesn't really matter too much. At least when they're choosing it purposely for an aesthetic, it doesn't really. At least in this film, I don't think it really matters too much, the darkness and the lightness. It's kind of more a tonal decision, and I think it was a pretty good one in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a good way to think about the choice of black and white versus color nowadays is some artists draw in just pencil and paper or ink and paper, and some use paints and full color. And I think it's totally down to what the artist prefers. Sometimes you'll be prepping an artwork and you'll think, this is definitely going to be in pen and ink, and if I added color, it'd ruin this. And sometimes you think, no, I definitely need to put color in this. I think that the black and white really works for this, not only because it adds to that kind of dream aspect. I swear I'm not going to keep going on about my dream theory. This isn't just the place where I'm pushing that.
Wake up, Zach.
But I think it does add this sort of feel of the period. And this movie doesn't look like it's trying to look like an old Western. Because those old Westerns tended to be a lot brighter. They tended to be the contrast in them tended to be a lot less radical. This is a movie where the darks are very, very dark, and the brights are typically quite bright. There's a heavy contrast in this movie. It looks more like a German expressionist film from like the 20s or 30s than it does like a John Wayne Western from the 50s or something like that.
Yeah.
But I do think the black and white really suits that kind of isolated, wintry feel to this movie. I feel like if you added color to this, regardless of how muted the color was or how limited you tried to make the color, I think that it wouldn't quite have the same kind of cold, isolationist effect. And to the same degree, I think there are scenes in this that are meant to be sort of majestic and splendid. They shot in some really cool locations for this film. I think there's some great shots of the Pacific Northwestern forest and kind of the rocky, more desert areas down south. And I think those bits are meant to be majestic. And I think if you were going for kind of a cold, isolated feel that comes from black and white in color, you would probably turn the saturation way down. You'd probably end up with something that looked like a Zack Snyder movie or something. And I think all the majesty of those outdoor sequences would be totally gone. So I'm personally a fan of the black and white. And I agree, No Country for Old Men definitely works better in color than it would in black and white. But I think a large part of that is that is a much more modern movie and a much more dynamic movie in a lot of ways than this. It's still a very nihilistic movie, and it's a very plain and simple movie. But when you look at it compared to this movie is using like really static setups and situations that are quite similar to something you'd see in a silent movie, whereas No Country for Old Men, I think, has all the production behind it of a modern 2007 studio film. And I think that's kind of the big difference between them. One's trying to be a big, entertaining movie, and I think one is trying to be more of maybe like an arty think piece. And I think that's kind of the dividing line.
I would say that if it is, I would say it's more like it's trying to more aggressively counter older westerns, I think. Because a lot of this actually has like Western genre cliches in it.
It does, yeah.
But it's kind of not poking fun at them, but it's actually like trying to intellectually defeat them, I guess.
Yes.
Mostly visually, and then also in certain conversations. Because it's kind of like, I guess you would say it's kind of like a, I know most people today probably haven't really watched westerns, like actual older westerns, but everyone can pretty much assume that older westerns are very focused on American pride and like gunslinging and joy rides on horses and things like that, very traditional things. And this is definitely like a direct counter to it, because it's it's kind of like false aspirations, pretty much. Like, it's kind of giving you a sense that maybe something good could come out of this. Like, maybe there's manifest destiny and things like that. But I think the black and white definitely emphasizes that it's false hope. It's not just like there's a non-existent, desolate, everything is terrible. It's kind of like there could have been something good here, but there wasn't, which kind of makes the nihilistic tone much more effective, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is 100% a revisionist Western. This is kind of taking those tropes from the old John Wayne, John Huston classic Westerns and taking them apart. I mean, when he gets off the train in this town, it's not like the Wells Fargo wagons pulled in and everybody's happy and bouncing around. Like, the streets are covered in mud. There's drunk people and prostitutes. The main thing in this town is a massive factory that spews smog all over the place. It's really taking those cliches of these old Western movies and kind of taking them apart and analyzing them, I think, in a more realistic or nihilistic viewpoint. One of the big aspects of this movie, or one of the big arcs throughout the movie, I suppose, is the idea that our protagonist's name is William Blake, which happens to also be the name of a well-known poet. And nobody actually points out that they have the same name, and he addresses Johnny Depp's character as if he is that poet throughout. And throughout most of the first half of the movie, he says, "I'm not that William Blake, I don't write poetry, I'm not that William Blake." And then about halfway through, he seems to almost accept that reputation. He's caught by two marshals. They ask, "Are you William Blake?" And he says, "Yes, I am. Have you read my poetry?" And then shoots them. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that arc and what you might have interpreted from it. What do you think that was meant to mean?
I don't know if I take that to mean he's accepting that he is some reborn, reincarnate version of the same William Blake that wrote that poetry. I think that's more of a callback to nobody saying that he can learn how to write poetry with his gun. And I think it's more of a broader representation of William Blake, the man from Cleveland, the American, not the poet, acclimating himself to the harsh surroundings that constantly confound him, and just finding a way to keep his head above water and to basically adapt to survive in the setting that he's been given. I don't take it as a literal representation of the poet William Blake is reincarnated to him. I think it's a broader comparison and more of an evidence-based conclusion as to how he fits into the broader Western setting that we've discussed earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. Mitchell, what did you think?
Yeah, I liked it, and I thought it was very creative, and but I mean, it wasn't like, it was relatively explicit. I don't think it was really, I mean, right when I heard that his name was William Blake, I was kind of expecting that they're going to make an allusion to it. I wasn't totally expecting that there was going to be like a whole, like it was going to be a part of the entire plot, that the fact that he was supposed to be like a lost spirit of this poet. But I mean, it was good for the cultural allusions, like I mentioned in my Twitter review, to actually have some of William Blake's poetry in this, and it also, like it kind of, like I was saying about the manifest destiny thing, it kind of fits into that lost soul of that, the fact that America could be like this great, we could make a lot of really great things and have love and peace and all that other crap happen after we establish ourselves in the West by killing Native Americans and things like that, and lawlessness and stuff. But I think that's a good symbolism. I don't think it was totally in my face. Like, I wasn't thinking they put it in there too much. I thought it was kind of an interesting concept. I thought it was pretty creative, but like, I don't know. It wasn't. It was. Maybe, I don't know. It might have been a little bit overused now that I'm thinking about it. But I don't know. Nobody's a good character. I'll say that.
Yes.
Nobody emphasizes it. Nobody emphasizes it better than nobody does.
Yeah, I do. I like Nobody a lot. I think he's a pretty great character. And Jim Jarmusch apparently really likes the character as well, because the character makes a cameo in another film that he made, a totally different movie that's set in like the 80s. So this character logically wouldn't even be alive at that time. But he's he's a cool character. We'll throw him in the 80s, you know?
Why not?
But William Blake kind of represents that he's like an outcast compared to the rest of the West. There's like everything about him is so ordinary. He's so much of an everyman, and like seeing the frontier is like hell, literally. It's like there's so much terrible things going on, and Nobody is pretty much, he's kind of like I guess the reason why he's named Nobody is because he's supposed to be nobody, and that William Blake's supposed to find himself, I guess, which is really trippy, man. Cheat you, try this stuff. But anyway, yeah, but that's cool. It's maybe a little too psychedelic for my taste, but I think it's an interesting concept, and I don't think that's really ever been done too much before. But yeah, it's all right. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one set interpretation for what this is necessarily meant to mean. But I think I'm definitely on board with you, Christian, on this one. Maybe to a different degree. I personally think that him kind of accepting that mantle of, yes, I am William Blake, have you read my poetry, is not him accepting, like, yes, I wrote those poems several decades ago. How do you like them? I think it's him sort of accepting that he now has the status of sort of a legend. He's gone from being just this mild-mannered accountant from Cleveland that nobody knows, who gets fired from his job in the first, 5 minutes of the movie, to being a man with his face and his name on wanted posters across the region. He's become this person that everybody knows about, or people are going to tell stories about. He's going to be a legend. He's going to be a well-known figure like the poet William Blake, and people are going to hear about him. And I think for the first half of the movie, he's kind of resistant to that. He wants to find some way to kind of escape this situation and just get things back to normal. And the second half, after he's accepted that, I think is when he becomes the dead man. And we see he's become more skilled with the weapon. He's learned to write poetry with his weapon, as
One with
Nobody
the dream,
says.
man.
Yes. And he's kind of accepted that there's no going back from this. And I think that's kind of what that's meant to symbolize.
I think he's definitely, and like I was saying, I'm going to keep mentioning this because I'm persistent. I have to be confident in how I feel in English class. But no more uhs and ums for me. Just kidding. Damn.
There we go.
So he's kind of represents this, I think, my opinion. Shouldn't say that. He's kind of like representative of optimism, and anything that could be good about America is dying and is going to die. And the Native Americans like, listen, bro, everything is going to hell here. There's nothing good that's going to come out of this. It's just going to get really bad. This whole westward expansion thing is not the move, bro. And he dies at the end, and he accepts. He kind of goes from he is enlightened essentially. Yeah. And I think that actually really helps the representation for Native Americans, by the way, because that's I think that's pretty, in a white man's opinion, I would say I think that's very historically accurate to how I think Native Americans felt about this whole thing. And it was just something that just these Americans are just dumb, and these white guys are just completely in it for power, and it's not a good look for what America's supposed to be. And in my opinion, I think that's what he represents. But yeah, I would definitely be on board with what you guys said as well. I can definitely see that. Him being like an ordinary man, and then, becoming this hero just because he's a poet and he writes really good, because every other gosh diddly darn American, he don't know nothing from nothing, boy. So,
yeah. I think there's a really interesting two-pronged approach to William Blake. You can almost do like a character study and then a study of what it means to be a good actor, I think. Because in my Twitter review, I said that this is probably Johnny Depp's most forgettable role, because I didn't think he was all that interesting, especially in the first half. He's kind of just this personification of white bread in a town that's surrounded by like toasted garlic bread or something, some crazy other flavor of
crazy bread.
Yeah, sure. And I don't know that is really a justified critique on my part, honestly, because that's really him performing to his mandate. And I think there's a broader discussion to be had about what constitutes great acting or what is the best acting, because it feels like a lot of the time, at least in prominent award shows and whatnot, the best actors and actresses, or best supporting actors and actresses, are often winners based on really sort of out there roles that require them to act in a very unusual manner, or like a very emotionally distraught manner. And the first example that comes to my mind is obviously Joaquin Phoenix as the Joker, playing a homicidal maniac. And obviously he's a brilliant actor, but is that performance any more good than a really accurate performance of the personification of white bread? I don't know. I think that's an interesting discussion to ponder. But yeah,
I have a hot take, and it's spicier than it is right now outside. And this is like the meme where Christian in his Twitter review is aiming at Christian during the podcast.
Yes.
But I'm going to agree with Twitter Christian right now, because I liked Johnny Depp as a crazy comparison. I liked him better in Sleepy Hollow, and I think and in Pirates of the Caribbean in general. And I think he does a lot better being very being subtle in his very obvious expressions, I guess. I wouldn't say, like, there's a difference between being subtle in general, like having subtle mannerisms, but then also kind of expecting like this, like Jack Sparrow being super surprised by something, and he's like, oh man, like that's like kind of like the face that he has, and that makes his character very unique in a Disney movie, Christian. But I think he generally performs in roles like that better when he's doing a lot more actiony things, but he also kind of has his very subtle reactions to things. And in Sleepy Hollow, it also kind of works very well in that regard also. And I think, you know, how piercing he is with his words and very expressive he is in that film I think it pays off a lot better than it would in this. And I can definitely see, like, Johnny Depp is very consistent with the way that he reacts to things. Like, I could see his other roles in there as well, like Edward Scissorhands. I could see his roles in there. But, I mean, I don't think this is the absolute best role he could have been chosen. So I would say out of all of his roles, I haven't seen all of the films that he's ever been in, obviously, but it's definitely more on the forgettable side. I can't really think off the top of my head of anything that was a film that I saw that was, you know, a lot worse for him in terms of casting him. But for the role that he was given, I think he did a pretty darn good job in this case.
I don't think... I would say I really enjoy this performance. I think the reason this doesn't stand out as much amongst his other performances is that Johnny Depp kind of has a reputation as this guy who plays crazy characters. And I think in this movie, he is playing a very, very normal man put in very, very abnormal circumstances. And that's kind of what the performance calls for. And I think despite that, he still goes on a genuine journey throughout this movie, and we see that throughout his performance. I would say... although this is definitely kind of on the mellower end of his performances, I would say it's definitely not in the realm of his most forgettable. I think Johnny Depp's most forgettable performances have been forgotten because he's been in some stinkers. He's been in some bad movies. I mean, The Astronaut's Wife, Transcendence, The Tourist. People don't remember these movies because they're bad movies. And, I mean, in Transcendence, Johnny Depp is basically just a prop, and he just sits in a chair the entire movie. I think those are the performances that fall into the forgettable range, whereas this falls into the more laid-back range, maybe. Now, last question. This movie is from the director of The Dead Don't Die, which we all saw together last summer at the theater, which was quite an experience. How do you think this movie compares to The Dead Don't Die, and which of the two do you prefer?
Well, I definitely prefer The Dead Don't Die, personally. I just find it much more entertaining and very, very, very funny and to my liking. And I don't know that these are very comparable movies, even though they have the same director. And there's definitely some, like, personal bias. Like, Adam Driver is one of my favorite actors, basically bar none.
I wonder why.
So, I mean, yeah, I am biased, but I definitely enjoyed The Dead Don't Die. I'd probably give The Dead Don't Die a 4, honestly.
Really? Wow.
On the comedy scale. I really, really loved it. And to me, this film just... this is going to sound very lazy, but it maybe required a little too much effort on my part to get invested in it.
Get out
so
of here.
it just wasn't for me. But...
I'm just kidding. I will say I might prefer this over Dead Don't Die. Boiling hot take. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, I was not the biggest fan of the Dead Don't Die. I'm gonna be honest. I never actually gave my opinion on the film. I don't know if you guys ever noticed, but I never actually really talked about how much I liked it. I thought it was all right. I might have to watch it again. The comedy is pretty good, especially for recent films. That's a very, very good comedy, and I think it might even transcend The Death of Stalin. I think.
Oh, really?
In terms of modern, comedies, but like Christian had said, I don't think these are very comparable. I think there's so many, like, tonally, it's totally different. The setting is completely different. The plot is entirely different. Maybe having two lead characters that everybody knows and versus having an ensemble cast, I think is comparable. But I mean, I don't know. I think The Dead Don't Die is definitely a very special boy. He's a very special child that we have to nurture. But I think, I just don't think they're that comparable. If I had to choose. If I was completely, I do not do drugs, by the way. If I had to do any certain drugs, I will not endorse any. Or I was just super tired and I was by myself. I had to find something to watch that I would be awake enough to think about. Then I would watch the Dead Man. But
Okay.
if The Dead Don't Die is perfect for group watching and you know, just joking about it and just being like the whole time. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching The Dead Don't Die, especially in the theater. I'm so surprised that movie got a wide theatrical release because they marketed it as this, like, big zombie comedy, like Zombieland or something. And it in actuality is a Jim Jarmusch movie. A lot of the movie is just the characters having conversations in rooms or cars. And I thought it was great to see that. When we saw it in the theater, there was a group of people in front of us, a group of young kids who clearly snuck in expecting World War Z. And throughout the whole movie, we could just hear them, like, confusedly going, like, what is going on to each other? So I loved seeing that in the theater. But I do think that I personally prefer Dead Man. I think as a film, I find Dead Man a lot more intriguing. And while I can think back to The Dead Don't Die and laugh, I think that might have been more of a one-time, really hilarious, fun experience, whereas Dead Man, I tend to go back to every couple of months, and every time I watch it, I can see something new in it, or I'm consistently intrigued every time I do watch it, as opposed to The Dead Don't Die, which I thought was a really hilarious joke on the Hollywood studio system that maybe doesn't hold up as much to repeated viewings.
And I have to say, definitely, Dead Man is way more intriguing. Okay, there's a lot more to think about, and I think there's a lot of symbolism that is definitely I would totally miss probably the only time of me seeing it. But yeah, I can definitely, and now that you're mentioning it, Zach, I can definitely see there's some comparisons with how the dialogue is written and how it's timed and things like that. But I will say that the dialogue in The Dead Don't Die is easy. It's more easily put into a comedy and deadpan comedy than it is in a strict think piece. So that's my final conclusion.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's fair. That brings us to the end of my discussion notes, so if we don't have any final thoughts, I think I'll hand it over to Christian for his segment. But it looks like we might have a final thought.
Yeah, I just have a couple quick things. I feel like I should mention, even though it's a critical negative, that I think the women in this film are pretty sorely represented. Pretty much every woman is portrayed in a sexual context until some of the Native American extras towards the end. So I would count that as a negative towards this film, unfortunately. Even if those
Historically
roles,
accurate.
Even still, I still think that it's a negative, and even if it's serving the plot and historical accuracy, I still see that as a critical negative, personally. And another thing that I was going to say is I think William Blake, his development into sort of this desperado figure, I think it would be a mistake to call it his fate or something he was striving towards, because when he initially earns that wanted reputation, he doesn't kill the woman he sleeps with, and he shoots the man mostly out of self-defense.
Oh, entirely.
So he's basically being wrongly accused of the murder. So I think that's an important detail that could easily be lost. And with regard to the Jim Jarmusch open air conversations thing for me. I think the biggest reason I can trace my preference back to The Dead Don't Die is because those conversations are hilarious and make the movie for me, whereas these conversations are mostly used for exposition and plot development,
Really?
and not in a particularly interesting way, in my opinion. So, except for like some of the open-ended ones, like the Iggy Pop scene. But for me, most of like the nobody William Blake conversations are kind of like plot heavy. We're walking in this direction. This is what you will become, William Blake. Blah blah blah.
I would say the plot development is more subtle. I think that it's easy to confuse plot development with like, you know, thought-provoking conversations that can be universally understood and analyzed. But I can see where you're coming from.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want us to go on all day, but I mean, I would argue, I think that a lot of the plot development here happens entirely based on the actions, and to me, the conversations feel like much more kind of moody, just kind of open-ended things the characters are saying. I know that nobody does have a lot of points where he's kind of describing what you will become, but I don't necessarily see that as much as plot development or exposition as I do kind of development of his character and what his character is striving towards, like what his role in the story is. And then agreeing with Mitchell, I would say that in terms of the representation of women in this film, there aren't many women in the film, and there is that kind of sexual connotation to all the female characters that do show up. But I think something to point out is the sort of main female character in the movie, Thel, who's killed at the beginning and is kind of in the scene that sort of sparks Johnny Depp's character going on the run. She does instigate kind of the sexual contact with Johnny Depp. She invites him back to her place, and she's kind of the one that's leading in that situation, which I think is important to bring up. It's not like every female character in this movie is taken advantage of by the male characters. So I think that's demonstrating some kind of strength in a way that's not necessarily like female characters getting out there on a horse and pulling out guns or something.
Fair enough.
Like The Quick and the Dead, by the way.
Yes, there is a great female gunslinger in Quick and the Dead, but I think we'll hand it over to you, Christian, then for
the rundown.
Hey.
Hey. 60 seconds. Terms from the movie we just discussed. We've got a really good one for you this time, Zach. Mitchell, I'm going to lead off this time, if that's all right with you.
No, it's not. Yeah, you can go.
All right, I'm going to count down anyway. 3, 2, 1. A very long train ride.
3 out of 5.
Iggy Pop.
3 out of 5.
He who talks loud, say nothing.
4 out of 5.
Native American representation.
4 out of 5.
Trusting words written down on a piece of paper.
3 out of 5.
Neil Young's Broken Gain Knob.
4 out of 5.
Philistines.
3 out of 5.
Industrialism.
3 out of 5.
Owning a gun because this is America.
3 out of 5.
Stinking beans sucking possum stinkers.
4 out of 5.
Stupid effing white men.
4 out of 5.
Dr. Octavius' side job.
3 out of 5.
Learning to speak with a gun.
4 out of 5.
Eating somebody who talks too much.
4 out of 5.
The same song over and over again.
4 out of 5.
William Blake the poet.
2 out of 5.
William Blake from Cleveland.
4 out of 5.
Not giving a heck who saw what, who did what, or who did who, by God.
3 out of 5.
Paper roses.
3 out of 5.
1 second.
Tobacco addiction.
3 out of 5.
Time. All right, you just got it off. Well
Really?
done,
Was
Zach.
that all of them?
I think we had one term left over.
Oh, I knew it was a long one this time, but I guess we got close. All right. Well, I guess as we wrap up this episode of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, I'll hand it over to Mitchell. Yes, Mitchell, to tell us what we're going to be talking about next time.
Well, because Christian had to roast Kirk Douglas so bad, we have to do Paths of Glory.
Yeah.
1957. It is very widely considered the best anti-war film of all time. Definitely up there in best war films of all time. It takes place in World War One. And I'm very interested to see what you guys take from it. And Stanley Kubrick's directing style. So have fun.
Yeah.
Yay.
Okay, I'm really looking forward to that. Christian might not be looking forward to it as much.
I will give it an honest try, and I hope I enjoy it.
That's
so,
fair.
if you want to see what Christian thinks of Kirk Douglas, does he still think his face is annoying? Let's find out on the next episode of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Bye.